Welcome back to Readers of the Right. So, authors, have you started any project lately? Are you concerned about whether your first chapter is hooky enough to actually catch the reader's attention? Well, today we're going to talk about some of the things not to do and some of the things to do to start your fantasy novel. First, we need to talk about what the goal and purpose of a first chapter actually is. What are you trying to achieve in that first chapter to actually get somewhere with your story? The first thing you need to do is hook the reader with the first line. Why is that important? What does that hook actually do? Well, the first line of a story is what sets the expectation for the story and catches the reader's attention. Often when you pick up a story or a book, you often see a thick book and you wonder if it's going to be worth reading all of that, what's going to happen, and why you should really care. Some readers will dive right into the story without even a second thought, but most of them need something to actually get them into the world and into the story. And a good first couple sentences grabs them by the nose and pulls them into the story so quickly that they go from wherever they are to your new world. One of my favorite examples of this is by one of my favorite authors, Brandon Sanderson, and he put this in the Final Empire. So I'm going to go ahead and read it so that you guys can understand what I'm talking about. He said, "Ash fell from the sky. Vin watched the downy flakes drift through the air, leisurely, carelessly, free." And while this isn't your typical conventional hook, this is one of my favorites, and one that I've tried to emulate. It's not successful yet so far, but the very first sentence, "Ash fell from the sky," hooks you and makes you wonder why there's ash. Why is it falling from the sky? What happened? And that hook is what pulls you into the story. Yes, Brandon is the master of hook after hook after hook after hook in the first chapters, to the point where you are so sucked in by the time you hit chapter 2 and 3 that you're not putting that book down. There's zero chance of you putting the book down. But the Final Empire has one of the best hooks to pull you in throughout that first chapter, so I had to at least put a little bit in there. The step 2 is the introduction of the protagonist. For the introduction of a protagonist, I'm actually going to pull one of my favorites from a movie, and that's Pirates of the Caribbean. For those of you who have seen it, remember back to Jack Sparrow's introduction. This is the perfect example of what you are trying to achieve. We see Jack Sparrow standing atop a mast, looking out over the sea like a good ship's captain, looking like the regal pirate he is, the most dangerous person around. But as the camera slowly pans out, we start to realize that, yes, he's standing on the mast, but he's standing on the mast of a dinghy. And that dinghy is sinking. And he is still just as confident as if he were standing on the prow of a giant warship as he is standing on the mast of a sinking dinghy as it pulls into harbor. And barely at that. So, how can we frame this in a way to introduce a character? Why is it important to introduce your protagonist in a fairly dramatic way so that the reader knows what to expect from them? Well, there's a lot of different ways we can do it, and every author has their own style. I will say that. But the introduction of the protagonist is the next layer of hooks. We need to relate to that protagonist, and get to know them at least on a basic level. For example, with Jack Sparrow, we A, know he's a pirate, B, we know he's extremely confident in himself, and C, we know he doesn't have the best of luck. life has not treated him well. And it actually continues into the next conversation, where he's speaking with a few of the guards who decide to arrest him. And he has the famous line where the pirate says, "You're probably one of the worst pirates I've ever heard of." And Jack Sparrow, instead of being insulted, which was the intent, looks at him, smiles, and says, "Well, at least you've heard of me." So this gives us a great picture of who Jack is and why we should care about him. Next, once we have the protagonist introduced, we need to introduce other key characters. This does not have to be in chapter 1. Trickle your key characters in throughout the first several chapters. But you may want to introduce 1, maybe 2 in the first chapter, depending on what you're going for pacing-wise and world-building-wise. So, one of my favorites for this is actually a Stephen King story called Gunslinger. And he introduces the gunslinger like this. The man in black fled across the desert, and the gunslinger followed. Simple introductions like this may be all that's needed. We may not need an in-depth introduction to a lot of the characters. Another great example of this is in Lord of the Rings, when Sam is introduced. Sam at first is introduced as the gardener. He's kind of a distant side character that's just there and is referenced from time to time, but he seems friendly, seems like a good guy, so that a few chapters down the road, when he's caught listening at the window, it's not hard to believe that his intent is good. He's wanting to protect his friend. And even minor introductions like that are perfect for these early chapters. Okay, next, we need to form an emotional connection with these characters. I'm going to go back to Lord of the Rings for this. The entire holiday party scene, or actually I think it's Bilbo's birthday. It's been a little while since I've actually read Fellowship. But the party introduces us to a lot of the main characters. We meet Merry, Pippin, Sam, Gandalf, and Frodo, and we see their emotional situations as is. We see Merry and Pippin being the life of the party. We see Sam being the very average dude who has a job, does the job, is in love with a girl who he thinks doesn't even know he exists, and we fall in love with them in a very human way. And this is one of the goals of the first chapters that a lot of authors actually struggle with. We do a lot of the first couple. We hook the reader, we introduce the protagonist, we introduce some key characters, but we fail to connect the characters to the reader. So once we've done that, we can also establish some expectations. One of my favorites that's done with this is a book called Theft of Swords by Michael J. Sullivan. He does a fantastic job letting a reader know what to expect from the story. He explains through a couple of scenes what the pacing and what the situation of the story will be. I'm not going to go into too much of it because I don't want to spoil anything. And yes, I know it's the beginning. But those are the 5 key things we need to do in an opening chapter. So what are some things we need to be careful of or absolutely not do in those opening chapters? I've got an entire list. We're going to talk about a few of them. And I've broken them into 2 categories, the never do's and the be carefuls. The never do's are ones that you should just never do. There may be some expert authors that pull them off, but 99.999% of the time, don't touch them. Be carefuls are a little bit different. They're ones that, if done right, are spectacular. If done wrong, can destroy your opening. So be very, very careful when doing those. So let's start with the never do's. A lot of these will be pretty straightforward and seem pretty obvious, so we won't spend a lot of time on those. But there's others that I do want to spend a little bit more time on so you guys understand. And we'll actually do that with the first one. And that's starting 10 pages before the beginning. What do I mean? Well, when we're starting a story, there's always a defined start point. There's a person stepping off a ship. There's a person stepping out of a door. Often the opening starts with somebody doing something that basically triggers everything. There's someone arriving in town or arriving on a ship to begin their life in a new place. Starting 10 pages before that would be starting on the ship as they're pulling into port, or starting on the ship while they're at sea. Sometimes that is just not great to do. It's very hard to get into a character, and you're not going to hook somebody 10 pages before the story actually starts. You need to start with that hook. So you need to start with the first bit of action that happens for that character. And if you do that, you will actually grab the reader. The next one, not introducing the main character. This one is the reason I say 99.9% of the time. I can think of a story that does this well. But you are not one of these authors, probably. Unless Brandon Sanderson or Patrick Rothfuss or Stephen King is watching this, don't do it. There are a few people who can do this, and you may think of a story that allows you to do this. You are not the most common denominator here, so be careful with it. And I do not recommend doing it at all, if you can. The next one is the exact opposite, introducing too many characters. Like I said, with your key characters, trickle them in through the first several chapters. Introduce one or two a chapter, maybe three, if they're closely related or they're married. But don't overwhelm the reader with names and faces. Let them have a chance to get to know each character as they're introduced. Next. This one is one that you have to be extremely careful with, because if you do it, you will violate the very first rule. And that is not creating conflict. Not creating conflict in your opening chapters does not have a hook. It strips you of hooks. So you need to create conflict to catch the reader's attention. Conflict is what grabs us. Conflict and tension is what drives the reader forward. You'll have plenty of time for the deeper emotional connections and the warm fuzzies. But in the opening chapters, you need some kind of conflict to actually get the story moving. Okay, next is starting with a summary. This is also a terrible idea. Summarizing a situation in the first chapter or so is one of the easiest ways to lose your reader, because they will immediately think, if that was important, why didn't you just tell me that story? And if it's important to summarize, it is important to the story, and you need to find a way to fit it in somehow without a summary. The next is related, info dumping. Authors love to info dump, but it is the fastest way to ruin an opening, well, one of the fastest ways to ruin an opening chapter or chapters. Info dumps immediately tear a reader away from the story and pull them out of their immersion. So just don't do them. There are ways you can do them later in the book. You can do a teacher-student relationship where a history teacher is teaching a high school student about some things that happened in the past. That is a decent way to get your summary and info dump in without being too hard to read. Don't open the book with it. That's a chapter 3 at the soonest situation, in my opinion. Once again, can be done, but don't do it, please. The next, making the reader feel dumb. Also a terrible thing to do for obvious reasons. You don't want to downplay the reader too much. You don't want a fantasy reader to feel like you're talking to a fifth grader. There are ways to be reader friendly to several different age groups of readers, but you need to be careful to not make your more experienced readers feel dumb by the way you're explaining things. Next, this one is going to be a little bit controversial for being in my never do's, and that is POV changes. Changing a POV early in a book should be done at the soonest at the chapter level. In my opinion, 95% of POV changes in books should happen at the chapters. Changing POVs or having a multi-POV view of the first couple chapters will confuse the living daylights out of your reader. And it will be hard to immerse because you have to get to know these characters before you can really get into their head. It's not hard with one or maybe two POVs. But once again, if you're doing multiple POVs, please split them into chapters if at all possible. Okay. That's all of the never do's. So let's dive into the be carefuls. Okay. The be carefuls are things I've actually seen done well and successfully, but are not recommended. First one is writing in present tense. Writing in present tense in a book is very difficult to accept because most of the time a story is told past tense. It's told about things that have happened. So even if you're writing something that takes place in the future, writing a present day narration of what's happening writing a present day narration of what is happening is something that's very difficult for readers to fully grasp and can throw a reader off. There are times to write present tense. It is typically not in the opening chapters of your novel. That being said, I have seen it done well. Just be careful with it. Next is opening with dialogue. Once again, I have seen it done, and I have seen it done well. But it is not something I typically recommend. It is very hard to get into dialogue before you know the characters. You have to understand their voice. You have to understand their perspective to really understand their dialogue. And if you haven't done any of that, it can be very, very hard. And the next one is starting with a description. Unless your name is Tolkien, this probably won't work for you. But that being said, I just gave an example of a hook. That's a description. So just be careful with it. Can it be done? Yes. Should it be done? Probably not. But it can be fantastic when it's done right. Your hook can be a description. Okay. The next, dream sequences. This is kind of a faux pas in the industry. It doesn't read very well and can be very jarring when that character wakes up. Now, dream sequences throughout the story are fine, but establishing reality is something that's extremely important in chapter 1, and a dream sequence kind of kills that. The next thing, killing the first character. Once again, I have actually seen this done, and it was pulled off spectacularly. Where the first character you meet is actually the murder victim. Typically, this is done in horror or mystery, where you have the chance to meet the person who dies before they die. This can be done. It shouldn't be done most of the time. So be careful with it, like I said. That's the entire point of this category. Next, world building. And by world building, we mean heavy world building. Don't go telling me about the religion of your society. Don't go deep diving into your world too heavily. There is some room for some world building. Like I said, Brandon Sanderson does this in The Final Empire, and it's fine. But be careful. Be careful about how far you take this, because world building, while readers love it, can be extremely overwhelming in the first couple chapters. So ease it on them. Put it on them carefully. Okay, the next, fancy language. If you're a Tolkien fan, you love the fact that he spent time creating the languages. But you'll notice he doesn't use any of those until well into the books. You see Dwarvish for the first time probably about a third of the way through The Hobbit. Elvish, I'm not even sure if you see it in Fellowship. You might. You might when they get to Rivendell. I don't actually remember. Like I said, it's probably been 6 or 7 years since I read Fellowship the last time. But fancy language is great. Don't put it in your openers. Having something like that will make it seem like they're reading a college textbook or something that is well above their reading grade, even though it's something minor and isn't too big of a deal. Okay, the next, backstories. Backstories can be extremely volatile in the opening chapters. Let the character get to know the current version of your character, the one who's active during the story, before you start filling in backstories. This kind of falls into the same category as dream sequences. You need to establish the current relevant world you're dealing with and the current relevant characters you're dealing with before a reader will understand what you're doing with a dream state or a backstory or a flashback. So be extremely careful with those. Once again, I've seen it done, but just be careful. Okay, the next one is cliches, for obvious reason. Cliches, an opening a story, screams, I'm inexperienced and I don't know what I'm doing, and will be an instant turnoff for pretty much any reader. And the last one is genre breaking. This you have to be careful with, but this can be done very well. Now, one of my recent favorites, The Art of Prophecy, pretty much opens up with this. It violates the Chosen One and subverts it almost immediately. But it does it in a way that doesn't seem jarring or improper. It kind of gives you warning signs that it's coming. Breaking rules of genre, especially in horror or romance, can be an instant killer for a book as well. So be extremely careful with this one. I almost put this in the never do's, but one of my recent favorites does this, so I felt like it would be a little weird for me to put it there. So here's a list of everything that you should not do to open your story, as well as some hints and some suggestions on what you can do. If you like this, don't forget to like and subscribe, and ring that little bell so you get notified anytime we have new stuff coming out. And we'll see you guys next time.